for any and every discrepancy under the sun. It's like Oprah Winfrey on a stage. You get some pills, and you get some pills, and you get some pills, and it doesn't matter if you need them or not. You're gonna take them, and you're gonna be happy, and you're not gonna be a problem for them anymore, because that is all they care about. Consider this episode your introduction to the topic of drug abuse in Opus Dei. If you are not currently up to speed on the conversation surrounding this organization and the plethora of accusations of human rights violations that it is currently facing, consider subscribing. I have years worth of information at this point on Opus Dei from covering them as an independent journalist here on the Deep Dive Project, and I like to think that there is something here for everyone. That being said, we really need to talk about this issue because it is so much worse than I initially thought. So let's not waste any more time on this intro. My name is Rebecca. Welcome to the Deep Dive Project. So before we dive in, this is just a reminder that here on the Deep Dive Project, I do long-form, in-depth research, and then I present my findings in videos to all of you here. These videos are generally pretty lengthy, so if that is not the kind of content that you are interested in, no hard feelings, but you probably won't enjoy my videos very much. However, if you do still want to watch the video, but maybe want to skip around a little bit, I have broken everything up into chapters so that hopefully you can navigate and access the parts of the video that you are the most interested in. So with that said, let's get into this. The issue, the topic, the controversy of alleged drug abuse in Opus Dei is not a new phenomenon. For many, many years, people have been attempting to raise the alarm about the environment that is inculcated inside the Catholic personal prelature of Opus Dei and the role that psychotropic drugs have played in that. However, these reports have been treated as unreliable and unworthy of notice the majority of the time, even following recent media coverage. The general vibe has been that these cases are random, one-off situations that are barely worthy of notice. Opus Dei swears up and down that any alleged human rights violations that may have occurred are the feature of some bygone, distant era, but the organization has been unable or unwilling to produce any kind of proof, provide any type of transparency, any sort of substantive documentation to back up those statements. It is becoming increasingly clear, at least in my opinion, that Opus Dei is skating by on the thinnest of semantics and relying on a campaign of suppression and deflection to keep its name clear, but that it is beyond unreliable and untrustworthy. Furthermore, alleged abuse of psychiatric medicine within Opus Dei has become widespread enough to warrant being featured in the 2023 International Ecclesiastical Institutional Complaint against Opus Dei for regulatory fraud, which was submitted to the Apostolic Nunciature of the Holy See in Spain by Antonio Moya Somalinos. I went through that entire document late last year, and I actually pulled it out again today for this episode. I still have all of my tabs, all of my notes, all of my highlights. So if you haven't seen that video yet, go back and check it out. I go through this thing line item by line item, so if you really want to know what's in there, you can watch that video, and I like to think that I did a pretty good job of breaking everything down. But I wanted to come back to it today and read through what the authors wrote on the subject of alleged drug abuse in Opus Dei, because it's pretty damning. So the authors state, the most painful consequences of the abuse present in Opus Dei are perhaps the suicides and the people who have abandoned the faith after leaving the institution. However, it is also important to address the abuses in the field of psychiatric medicine, used to break the will of those who dare to express any discrepancy regarding the institutional inconsistencies they have observed. These abuses are abundant, and their effect translates into the generation of depression in members who previously enjoyed good health and psychological balance. So, based on the language used here, Moya et al. Are taking the position that the abuses in the field of psychiatric medicine in Opus Dei specifically are abundant, and that they are used to break the will of anyone who dares to raise any concern or issue with the organization, and that because because of the abuses of these drugs, the fact that members are being placed on them when they don't need them, at doses that are too high, in an effort to suppress and control the will of the individual, the free thought of the individual, people are developing depression and other mental illnesses as a result of their interactions with this organization. People who had no history of mental illness prior to coming into contact with this organization. That is significant. And the role that the abuse of psychiatric medicine plays in this entire mess cannot be overstated, in my opinion. The paragraph goes on. Although it could be argued that there have always been people with a certain psychological vulnerability and that this is also manifested in the religious sphere, the high proportion of people under psychopharmacological treatment at Opus Dei is surprising, especially among numeraries compared to other church institutions. In addition, these methods have been applied by physicians who are tenured members, some of whom are not specialists in psychiatry. Even more worrying is the fact that these doctors have left signed blank prescriptions at the centers, allowing in many cases the directors of the centers, without being doctors, to prescribe psychotropic drugs, thus violating the most basic principles of medical and Christian ethics. Its sole objective is to annul the will of the dissenter, turning him into a broken person who, in many cases, has been returned to his parents after having ruined his life. I want to read that last line one more time, and I really want it to sink in. The sole objective of the abuse of psychiatric medicine inside Opus Dei is to annul, basically render void, the will of the dissenter, the person who is raising the issue or asking too many difficult questions, turning him into a broken person, someone who can no longer function in life, who in many cases has been returned to his parents after having ruined his life. People's lives are being destroyed as a result of this behavior and this treatment. Opus Dei has no interest in actually helping people, and I do not understand how it could be any more clear than it is right here. If this organization actually cared about the well-being of the people that are living under its roofs, taking its vows, giving their lives in duty to this thing, then I think you would probably be able to tell. And Moya et al. Take the position that these alleged actions constitute true criminal intent and violate numerous canon laws. They wrote that the crime of the illegitimate deprivation of liberty, as it is defined in Canon 1397 and Article 125.2, is evidenced in, quote, the cases of auxiliary numeraries, numerary assistants, or numerary priests incarnated in the prelature, and in the case of abuse of power depriving the individual of liberty through the use of psychotropic drugs, end quote. Moya et al. Are treating this situation and others like it with real seriousness, and I think that as members of the public, we should give the stories that former members have shared their due diligence. In this episode, we are going to look at accounts and testimonies from several different former members of Opus Dei, and I guess I won't bury the lead here. They are all eerily similar and all recount the same type of suppressive behavior. One has to wonder, the word systemic comes to mind. But for legal reasons and for reasons pertaining to journalistic integrity, I have to say that these accounts are anecdotal and alleged. However, while Opus Dei would like everyone to believe that these accusations are just lies and fabrications, it is important to acknowledge that in 2016, the institution of Opus Dei, as well as several individuals representing the institution, were found guilty and convicted in France of multiple criminal breaches of labor law. In the court case, Tissier v. Opus Dei. Opus Dei, the corporate work where the victims have been employed, and I say that with quotation marks because they were not paid, as well as two of the corporate work's employees, were made to pay several hundreds of euros in fines to a total of 73,000 euros. And I have already discussed this case in previous episodes, but the reason I am bringing it up again is because the individual who initiated the lawsuit, Catherine Tissier, was also exposed to suppressive and controlling techniques with with the use of drugs. And experts called to testify during her trial stated that the story she tells is quite characteristic of the influence of certain sects on their members, with early recruitment and commitment, total adhesion, a shared ideal, the implementation in place of a relational technique with one or more guardians, a technique of guilt and imposed secrecy, which leads to sub-depression, even depression, and induces greater dependence on the sect in which therapeutic hope is formed. After several months of normal life and privileged relational support, the disappearance of the personality anomalies demonstrates that the depressive acts were generated by the abuse of authority, which controlled conscience and kept her in a social precariousness which deprived her of all freedom. The vulnerability of Catherine Tissier is sufficiently demonstrated by the two expert reports which describe, at the time of the facts, a manifest psychological vulnerability with a subdepressive or even depressive state inducing dependence on others. It does not matter that the first expert dates this vulnerability back to a period prior to his entry in the Dawson School. The expert in question was the Opus Dei psychiatrist who was supposed to be looking over Catherine and making sure that she was getting the care that she needed. In addition, the testimonies relied on by the defendants to demonstrate that Catherine Tissier was not able, due to the fragility of her state of health, to work with others and had to be taken care of, also contribute to the demonstration of apparent vulnerability. Finally, the medical certificate issued by Dr. Comont, who examined her during her return to the parental home in 2001 and concluded the need for gradual drug withdrawal following a heavy treatment with neuroleptics, sedatives, leaves no doubt about her vulnerability, which is quite apparent to all those who were in contact with her on a daily basis. So there are three key things that I would like to point out about these paragraphs from the court case. The first is that the medical experts established the fact that Catherine's story lines up with the stories that other survivors of high control groups, cults, and sects report having. The majority of the mental health issues that she suffered while she was in Opus Dei were a result of the abusive authority that she was subjected to, and that rather than helping her, the drugs that they gave her made everything worse, induced a vulnerability in her, and kept her from being able to live her life. And the fact that once she was removed from that environment and allowed to reestablish meaningful relationships with the people in her life, her symptoms disappeared. And that points to this institution and this organization being the culprit and the problem, not the individual themselves. I think it is really important to keep that in mind, and that is a fact which will continue to be emphasized throughout the rest of this episode. And I have quite a bit of documentation about Tissier v. Opus Dei, including an unofficial English translation of the French court case and a Q&A document that breaks down the facts and findings of the case, and those are linked down in my source document in the description of this video. So if you're not familiar with this case and you would like to learn more, those two documents and the couple of videos that I've done will probably get you caught up to speed. But I bring it all up again today because it is such an important case. It establishes precedent for holding not just Opus Dei's corporate works responsible, which Opus Dei claims to have no interest or attachment to, but also the organization as a whole, which is a huge problem. Opus Dei has been very skillful at avoiding any type of meaningful litigation, and they've always maintained that there is no institutionalized problem and that the experiences that so many former members report having are these random outliers in an otherwise pristine and holy organization. But I think that by looking through these accounts and these cases, the truth becomes self-evident. But because of that attitude, the organization has been able to more or less totally avoid any type of meaningful accountability, except in Tissier v. Opus Dei. And that case establishes that, at least in that particular situation, Opus Dei not only exerted undue influence over Catherine's life and her will to live, but that individuals representing the organization seemingly didn't bat an eye at referring Catherine to an Opus Dei doctor who prescribed her increasingly heavy doses of tranquilizers. And I think that it would be reasonable to deduce that the situation that Catherine endured is not an anomaly, but rather an indication publication of a standard operating procedure that, according to a number of former members from different regions around the world, has been utilized to suppress and control not just the truth, but also the free will and bodily autonomy of innocent people. And I refer you again back to the 2023 complaint by Moya et al. Now, something else that I want to bring up before we get into these stories is an Opus Dei internal document titled the Vademecum. From what I understand from reading an Opus Libris post titled The Psychiatrists of the Work, it includes directives about spiritual practices within Opus Dei, the role of directors, and how new members should be guided in their formation. And it includes instructions on maintaining Opus Dei's spiritual ideals, managing personal growth, and fulfilling the apostolic mission. It is the Opus Dei internal playbook. And at one time, you could actually download and save this from the Opus Libris site, but it appears to have been removed following the litigation between the founder of Opus Libris and Opus Dei. And if you are unaware, Opus Libris published some internal documents on the site, which Opus Dei had traditionally vehemently denied the existence of, internal documents that govern the lives of the people who join Opus Dei that no member of the public or the members themselves or even the Pope has any authority to see. But following the publication of the Vademecum on Opus Libris, Opus Dei sued the site's founder in a Madrid court, and Opus Dei won that suit, but in so doing, validated the existence of these internal documents in question. Now, I don't want to get off into too much of a tangent or a sidebar, but I do find that court case between Opus Dei and Opus Libris kind of hilarious, just for the simple fact that it completely undid any work that Opus Dei had ever accomplished in convincing people that these documents don't exist. They ended up validating that by suing this website for the fact that they put this document up. And I just think that that is really, really funny. And I think it also goes to show how unprepared and ill-equipped Opus Dei is to deal with reality or truth. And I guess that kind of stands to reason because their entire business model seems to be built on lies and fabrications and obfuscations of reality. So if you refuse to even acknowledge those things, you're not going to be able to contend with them even when they're staring you straight in the face. Anyway, in this article on Opus Libris, the author used a passage from the Vademecum to illustrate his allegation, which is that a psychiatrist operating within Opus Dei is a whistleblower, something the Vademecum seems to encourage. The quote that he cites states that, in these cases of depression and exhaustion, one should consult an experienced and prudent doctor, better if they are a member of the work. It is very important to inform the directors in order to provide effective help to those who need it. This quote leaves the impression of an institution with a vested interest in inserting itself between a patient and their doctor and into the decisions that are made concerning the health of that patient. And that is just so wrong on so many different levels. Now, since Opus Libris published this back in 2004, it is possible that the Vademecum has been revised or is no longer in use at all, and so that attitude is no longer present. But I find that pretty hard to believe for three main reasons. The first is that I have heard firsthand accounts from former members who hold that the organization is incapable of changing, does not want to change, and believes itself perfect in every way as a divinely inspired institution. The second reason is because of an excerpt from the Vademecum, which states that everything written in the Vademecum is in both substance and form, not only good and noble, but holy. In all these notes, the exclusively supernatural nature of this work is reflected, the Spirit willed by God for Opus Dei. That statement paints the organization into such a corner because it is unable to acknowledge wrongdoing without invalidating this and every other statement citing Opus Dei's divine origins. And the third and final reason is because of revelations that are shared in the 2023 complaint that I referenced earlier, which state, among other things, that, quote, although Opus Dei denies it, any legal solution that is given to them, the leadership of Opus Dei will take as something to cede without conceding with the intention of recovering. They will wait, they openly say so, for this pope or the next one to pass in order to recover what St. Jose Maria Escriva wrote. This attitude stems from apparent dissatisfaction within Opus Dei's internal government with the sanctions and restrictions that have been imposed on the organization, which they feel force Opus Dei out of alignment with Jose Maria Escriva's intentions. But at any rate, I mention all of this, the statements from the 2016 Tissier case and the 2023 international complaint, as well as the Vademecum, in order to create a general impression of exactly what we are dealing with here. And hopefully at this point in the video, you're starting to realize that this thing is pretty significant. So let's go ahead and get into this thing a little bit more and hear from some of those who allege first-hand experiences of psychopharmacological abuse in Opus Dei. This first account was published in a series of articles on Opus Libris by a user with the handle Novalio La Peña. Since he doesn't reveal his name, I'm going to refer to him as Valio for the duration of this episode. His story lives as a document with the title Autobiography of a Numerary, Men's Branch 2010. And that version contains more details than the individual articles, but I have linked them both in my source document down below. His entire story is 36 pages long if you were to download the PDF, and he begins by writing, "I finally decided to write my story. It is recent, and if I have not done it before, it has been out of fear." He adds that he chose to omit names because he's not interested in fomenting a witch hunt. He wrote, "I am not the one to judge people who have hurt me. I forgive you and wish you the best. But since I don't want others to go through the same thing as me, I have decided to write it." In the first chapter of his account, he reveals that he attended an Opus Dei school, attended Opus Dei clubs, and had several family members who were or are currently still in the organization. And get this, he writes, "Before I was 14 years old, my club preceptor, a numerary, had already raised my vocation as a numerary. And I say, can decisions be made for life at that age? I leave it to your judgment." After 2 conversations with that numerary for more than an hour about why he was convinced that I had a vocation as a numerary, I went to pray and said, yes, I have a vocation. I remember that I was not even 14 years old yet. I had to wait 7 months before I could write the letter asking to be an aspiring numerary, referred to now as a junior candidate. And that's the thing, too. Opus Dei tries to say that, well, if people were recruited at a very young age in the past, that is something that no longer happens. We don't allow people to join the institution until they are the age of legal majority in their country, and that's just the way that it is. But this story did not occur that long ago. Valio was at Opus Dei up until 2010, so that kind of calls into question how uncommon the recruitment of children is today. Additionally, they have this title for kids who are interested in joining Opus Dei called junior candidate. And in my opinion, this is just more obfuscation of the truth. The term doesn't actually mean anything. It's just a word that they made up. And I tend to doubt that there is a whole lot of difference between the experiences that kids are having now with Opus Dei versus what they had a decade or 2 decades ago. That's just my opinion, though. Regardless, at least in Valio's story, I feel like it contributes to the general perception that this organization is targeting children. Because Valio was not yet 14 years old when an adult began to apply pressure, hours worth, according to his account, to convince him of his vocation to Opus Dei. And isn't it interesting that nobody ever realizes they have a vocation to Opus Dei on their own? Somebody has to reveal it to them. Isn't it weird that nobody's able to determine that for themselves? By the time Valio was 19 years old, he had been appointed to a position within the study center that he had moved into after graduating high school, as well as to a position as the director of an Opus Dei House of Formation. He writes, "I was only 19 years old, but I was a 100% Opus person, 100% faithful to what the work needed. There was no time for my things. And I was delighted, for the record. I had been trained for that, and that is what I did." And so, as a malleable and dedicated fanatic of the work, he became the ultimate yes man that the organization demanded that he be. And like he said, he was happy to do it. It was, after all, his vocation. During the ensuing years, he was shuffled from city to city, from internal position to internal position, sometimes straddling multiple positions at once. And he discusses the way Opus Dei moves the goalposts and manipulates members like him. For example, he wrote, "They ask you to be prepared to say yes when they need you as a priest, but at the same time, you have to be prepared if they never call you because they don't need you as a priest or simply think you aren't useful for it. They will tell you that it doesn't matter because the vocation is the same and so on and so forth, but in reality, what they do is simply what is best for them." So whatever Opus Dei asked of him, Opus Dei got, and this included learning new languages, integrating into wildly different cultures, and uprooting his entire life to move to new countries on different continents. And all of this happened within the span of only a few years, between 2003 through 2010, when Valio ultimately exited the organization. So let that sink in. Have you ever tried to become fully fluent in a new language in like a year or two or less time? Even if you have an aptitude for languages and they come very easily to you, that is still a very tall order. And Valio did it. At one point, he writes that to give perspective of how rigorous and difficult these studies were during a particular course that he took, 20 people enrolled and only 3 people actually completed the course, and he was one of them. He also mentions that in addition to spending almost 20 years in Opus Dei with more than 10 years in various internal positions, he also had a biennium in philosophy, a quadrennium in theology, a nearly completed bachelor's degree in moral theology, plus 2 years in the Roman College and 4 years in Villa Tavere. This guy is not a slouch or some sort of mindless drone. Opus Dei does not recruit those kinds of people, not for internal positions of government anyway. It seems like they want a very specific kind of person, an idealist with a solid work ethic and a desire to serve, and they want free thinkers who aren't too independent. And they take people like that and force them to conform to the Opus Dei way and do everything possible to stifle and suppress the free will and conscience of the individual. I mean, that is just my perspective, my take, my opinion of the situation, but that is what seems like is happening to me. So what ends up happening to Valio is unfortunately not so different from what others have reported. He was placed into a position referred to as the Defender of the Regional Commission, which is the highest position in the internal government of the men in that region. This meant that he was required to meet with the regional vicar daily to read the reports, notices, and consultations that arrived at and left the commission, and he describes how being exposed to these internal documents and the organization's decision-making process ultimately created a crisis of conscience. He wrote that, "It is difficult to summarize in a few words how and why a crisis can come and how mine came. I did not leave because I had a vocation doubt or crisis in the sense of not being clear if that was the path that God wanted for me. My crisis was not personal. It was not my own. It was institutional. I was willing to give my life to God, but could I really still think that God was there?" And just to insert my own perspective on this really quickly, that perspective and the feelings that he is describing here really resonate with me. This is a topic for another day, but as someone who had to work through and come to grips with the history of a religion that I had been raised in from a child and taught to love and respect, I really relate to what he is saying here about how the crisis wasn't personal and it wasn't about faith in God. It was about faith in an institution that he had become aware of was morally corrupt from the inside out. That really just resonates with me. He goes on to say, "As time went by, the things that I did not like and that my conscience said were wrong were more and more. I saw them in my house and also in the other centers. I heard them when people spoke to me or consulted me, but I denied them. I was convinced that the work was perfect, and that is why I repeated to myself, the problem is yours. You must be wrong because the work is of God and therefore perfect, and your brother directors in Rome know all the regions well. I was like that for several months, but things were getting worse and worse, and after a period of humility, of continuing to silence my conscience and deep down deceiving myself, I decided that I could no longer continue denying the obvious." So Valio wrote a letter to the prelate. He gave it to his regional vicar and was open about why he wrote it. But all he received from Rome were crickets, so he wrote a second letter. He gave it to his regional director again, and they spoke at length about it. But rather than receiving any type of validation for his concerns or recognition of the issues he was raising, all his regional vicar had to say was, "What you can't say is that we don't strive to do our best." And if by best he means his best not to deal with reality, then I would say that that is very true. After that letter was faxed to Rome, he was summoned there the next day. And despite a polite acknowledgement from his regional vicar, no substantive dialogue or acknowledgement of his concerns was forthcoming. Instead, he was just abruptly summoned to Rome under the impression that decisions about his future would be made without his input, which served to only deepen his disillusionment with the organization's decision-making process and commitment to transparency and personal respect. The lack of transparency and respect contributed to the inner turmoil that Valio experienced, sending him on a roller coaster of conflicting emotions, sometimes questioning his decisions to write the letter, and other times reaffirming his commitment to see the issues he had brought up to some type of conclusion. Prior to departing from Rome, Valio learned that an Opus Dei priest that he had known well for many years at that point had been sent to his region on a surprise visit to cheer up the atmosphere, making it clear that the visit was intended to simultaneously bolster morale and downplay any negative feedback. It was, in essence, intended to suppress any concerns, creating a nothing to see here atmosphere. Valio arrived in Rome to Villa Tevere on a wave of anticipation and relief, expecting answers and some type of validation for his concerns. And initially, it seemed like that would be what he would get. His reception at Villa Tevere was warm and accommodating, and he was treated with special attention and encouraged to enjoy himself and his stay. However, Valio soon noticed a lack of genuine interest in discussing the issues he had raised, to the point that when he directly inquired about them, he was told that the topics would not be addressed, the implication apparently being that the issues would be too challenging and inconvenient for the directors. Instead of giving his concerns due attention, Valio was instead referred to an Opus Dei doctor priest for medical review, which Valio felt was a diversion from addressing his concerns. Valio doesn't identify this doctor by name, but he was immediately labeled as obsessive and asked leading questions about his well-being and mental state, and prescribed a cocktail of several different drugs intended to help him distance himself from his problems and stress. Valio was told to start taking the medication immediately and not pay too much attention to the medical inserts, which are intended to provide patients with informed consent about their medical decisions. Valio's compliance was expected and contributed to Opus Dei's strategy of managing perceptions and maintaining control. This strategy had several different facets, which Valio described as a minimization of the issues he had raised, with an emphasis that any problems were personal rather than related to Opus Dei, a shifting of focus to Valio himself, in which he was made to believe that he was the problem and that he needed to change, rest, and distance himself from his concerns, exaggerated care and kindness intended to create a sense of belonging so that he would not question or assess his situation critically, which is essentially love bombing, and manipulative conversations intended to manipulate Valio's thoughts and feelings, including any doubts about his supposed vocation and the implication that he would be nothing without Opus Dei. Valio was expected to conform to the organization's expectations, suppressing his doubts and concerns. In conversations with the prelate, Valio was told that he should have patience and adapt to different cultural contexts, further contributing to the atmosphere of suppression and the minimization of his concerns. During and following his stay at Villa Tevere, Valio began to experience dizziness and fatigue. On the plane ride back to his center, Valio had a moment of profound clarity in which he realized that he had been deceived, ignored, and suppressed. His feelings of betrayal deepened. He wrote, "Once again alone with God, I could not deny something that would be evident to anyone's eyes. They have not let you speak. They have not discussed the issues that concerned you, and also they have told you that you are obsessed, and they have even medicated you for that. Why can't you talk about those issues? Didn't they appoint you to be the delegate? So, if they gave you that position, why don't they even listen to what you ask? Isn't it your family? Isn't obedience in the work supposed to be intelligent? You are not refusing to obey what they answer you. The problem is that they don't even answer you. On the other hand, are you really sick? Do you really need the medication? Okay, very well, you are tired and sometimes you have not slept well, but it is normal. Who could go to sleep easily knowing that he is giving his life for something that is not what he thought? Losing sleep over important things is not only normal, but it shows that you really love. But does that mean you're sick? Of course not. You have a very normal life. You have many friends. You do sports 2 days a week. You go out, meet people, study, work, fulfill your plan of life without any problem. You're fine. Valio's decision to leave was made, but it took time for him to fully cut the cord. Before that, he spoke to people that he trusted, family and friends who could provide an impartial perspective and support. Lastly, he spoke with a priest who was not in Opus Dei, but whom Valio trusted. He writes, I told him a little bit about what had happened in my trip to Rome and asked him what he thought. He told me that in all institutions of the church there are problems, that it is normal for there to be misunderstandings, that sometimes things are done badly, but not with bad intentions, that you always have to forgive. I said, yes, I know that, and I would have said the same as you, but the problem is that I have not explained myself very well. Let me tell you better what I mean. And after talking for a long time, I told him, that's why I've come to talk to you, because despite the fact that in the work it is bad spirit to address a priest who is not from the work, I need your advice. What do you think? So, in addition to this priest being flabbergasted that Valio should not be allowed to talk to him because he is a priest like any other priest in the Catholic Church, he also advised Valio to stop taking the pills and to not take them again. He asked Valio what they were for, and of course he didn't know because he hadn't even read the label. So the priest told him to read it, but to not take them anymore, and he expressed the opinion that the drugs were probably why Valio had been feeling so strange. He said, don't take them anymore, you are healthy. He told him to leave Opus Dei and to not lose the faith. And Valio told him, yes, if I go, it is precisely because if I am still there, either I will really go crazy, because I spend my life denying what is evident and I have to seriously medicate to be able to bear such a lie, or I lose the faith. After what has happened to me, am I going to be able to continue thinking that God is in the church or in any human institution? I thanked him for his advice and asked him to pray for me. He told me that God would help me. I said, yes, I know, but I have to start a life totally from scratch. I do not have a visa to be in this country. My visa depended on them. I do not have a job. I have almost no professional experience, only part-time Spanish teacher for just over a year. I do not have a home or a place to stay. I have no money. Almost all of my friends are related to the work. And his priest friend asked him, why don't you have any money? After all those years there, they are going to help you, right? And Valio said, no. When you leave with nothing. Everything you earned is no longer yours, and if you worked for them, no matter for how many years, you don't get anything either. And his friend said, how is that possible? In my congregation, if a priest leaves for any reason, he is assigned a salary, he is given an amount every month. It is normal. It is a way of thanking them for their work for so many years. Forget it, Valio said. Things are not like that here. Upon returning back to his center, he took the time to actually read his medications inserts, and Valio was shocked to learn that they were intended for conditions that he did not have, such as depression, OCD, bulimia, and epilepsy. Improperly prescribing psychotropic drugs is dangerous and could kill a person. This glaring and unethical situation, coupled with the lack of genuine concern for his and other members' well-being, and Opus Dei's prioritization of its own interests over the happiness and well-being of members' lives, were the final linchpins in Valio's decision to leave. He departed his center during the dark of night, and he wrote, I managed to load all of my bags in the taxi that was waiting for me, and I left. I remember the thrill of closing the center door after leaving the keys on the steering table and giving a sigh, saying, it's finally over. Valio's story is so intense, and I cannot imagine what he must have felt like leaving the organization after 20 years and coming to grips with this new realization and understanding of this thing that he perceived as holy and good for so long. I mean, again, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. People do not dedicate years and years of their lives to something like this unless they actually believe in it. And I can only imagine the horror and the pain that comes with realizing that you bought in under entirely false pretenses and that you believed in a sham. So the next story that we are going to share is from another former Numerary member of Opus Dei. This is someone who I have talked about before on this channel. I am a big fan of her work and her willingness to share so candidly about her experiences. I am talking about Eileen Johnson. She has written and spoken extensively about her time in and experiences with Opus Dei. She was a member for 11 years and was groomed by her French teacher and whistled when she was just 16 years old. Eileen has pushed back repeatedly on the idea that Opus Dei does not exert undue control or influence over people's lives. She has stated that it has been said by defendants of Opus Dei that those who join do so willingly and have no right to criticize the organization after they leave. Such a judgment overlooks the fact that people, especially young, impressionable people, do not join cults. They are recruited, often after being groomed. This process can erode their ability to make informed decisions of their own or use their free will. The targeted individuals, usually teenagers, are normally intelligent and gifted and good leaders. They are made to feel cared for and special. They develop a great sense of belonging to a spiritual family that claims to be destined to transform society by winning people over to the teachings of its founder, Jose Maria Escriva. During 3 of her 11 years, Eileen worked as an assistant directress at a student center. Due to her position, she was able to access information and documentation that the average member or the public do not see. This included the fact that Opus Dei chose to respond to members' struggles by instructing them to go to an Opus Dei psychiatrist, fomenting active distrust of the individual's experiences through gaslighting and shifting the blame from the institution onto the individual. Not only did Eileen witness this happen to others, but it happened to her as well, to such a degree that she questioned her own lived reality and grasp on sanity. In an article titled Dead or Alive, an Opus Dei Survivor Speaks, published on Opus Libris, Eileen discusses how even 50 years on from her experiences, she still struggles to put those experiences into words, partly out of a desire not to cause harm or distress to the good people that she knew while she was on the inside. But she feels it is her duty to speak up and share the truth. She says, "Life in the work suits many, but many others, having been recruited too early in their lives, have suffered to varying degrees over time as a result. This was true in my case and in that of many others too. The outcome was deeply damaging for me." Her personal experiences with those representing authority in Opus Dei were, to be quite frank, harrowing and disturbing. She wrote, "At 16, I was a bright and happy student, an all-rounder who loved singing, dancing, and life in general. I wanted to become a language teacher, and it seemed I was poised to move on to a successful adulthood. I had met my first love. This was one of the happiest times of my life. But I was unaware that I was being watched by an Opus Dei Numerary, one of my school teachers, who proceeded to groom me through her friendship. I had never heard of Opus Dei and did not know she was a member. After I left Opus Dei 12 years later, I was a shadow of my former self. I became suicidal, and my doctor said that the only cases he had seen of this level of distress were former prisoners of war. Why? Well, for one thing, I had been on medication prescribed by Opus Dei numeraries, doctors, and psychiatrists for 4 years before I was able to leave. I was one of many treated in such a way. This was unethical. Had I been able to consult an objective doctor, I may well have left 4 years sooner than I did. Independent diagnosis after I left concluded that my problems arose due to the regime I had been subjected to and the cocktail of drugs prescribed. Our GP, Hyacinth Hickey, who on her arrival in the UK from Ireland in the 60s was put in charge of the health of all of us numeraries and assistant numeraries, had prescribed a variety of drugs to several of us. In my case, she tried me on Librium, Tofranil, Mogadon, and Lithium before settling on Valium. When I was sent to Pamplona for a year to study journalism at Opus Dei's University of Navarre, the treatment was handed over to my spiritual directress, a Spanish woman doctor who continued to prescribe Valium to me and medication to another English numerary who accompanied me. I have heard of numbers of former assistant numeraries and numeraries who were drugged in-house by fellow members of Opus Dei in the UK, Spain, North and South America. Many, like myself, were referred to Opus Dei psychiatrists. This was totally unethical, involving clear conflicts of interest. When I was eventually able to consult a doctor in the outside world after leaving Opus Dei, he said that the only comparable case in his experience was that of a former prisoner of war. I have heard similar reports from other former members, particularly those who spent many years in Opus Dei and/or were of a sensitive disposition. A major criticism of Opus Dei, in my experience, is that we were recruited with scant regard for our individuality or for our well-being or personal development. We were, quite simply, used. The recruitment and treatment of the assistant numeraries was a particularly obvious and stark example of this. Yet the systemic exploitation, coercion, and brainwashing of numeraries, specifically in the women's section, was also appalling. For me, the worst thing was the use of friendship as a tool for proselytism. As someone who values friendship greatly, to be without friends over many years was a form of social starvation, so that when I left, I felt dangerously alone in the world. My doctor, very concerned about the degree of my isolation as I approached my 30th birthday, suggested that I contact Opus Dei to see if one or other of my former sisters might come to see me. My mother phoned and spoke to a numerary who had formerly been a close friend of her and our family. She agreed to come and arrived the following day for a brief visit. The next day, she phoned to say she had been instructed not to contact me again. She said she was phoning from a coin box in the street to avoid being overheard. That lady was genuinely fond of me, of my mother and my family, particularly my young nephews. She was the same age as me, had joined Opus Dei at the age of 14, and was popping Valium with alarming frequency. Soon after this, I took an overdose. I remember facing the probability of death, but the prospect of going on existing in such despair, isolation, and rejection was too bleak. After I came round in hospital, my doctor took me off the Valium I had become dependent on. A week later, he commented, now I see the real Eileen. Your eyes have come alive. Opus Dei generates a great amount of fear. It is said that fear is mentioned more often in the Bible than any other word. Fear is a limiting and negative human emotion. According to Christian scripture, perfect love casts out fear. There should be no problem about speaking out one's opinion, offering constructive criticism. In fact, such criticism is a responsible, helpful attitude, though difficult to express and often not well accepted. In Opus Dei, to criticize the perfect work of God was deemed to be down to pride. The day I left, I spoke to the prelate of Opus Dei in Britain in the confessional. I told him that I thought my depressive illness had been wrongly handled by members of Opus Dei prescribing me drugs, and Opus Dei psychiatrists becoming involved, and my spiritual directors going along with the process. Again, he said I was proud to criticize the work. With hindsight, I see I was right. In fact, I knew at the time I was right, though I was too broken to state my case. It took me some 20 years to be able to speak out. First, I needed to recover and live as normal a life as possible. There is something wrong when so many individuals need to remain anonymous and are afraid to speak out. Not that I am saying that wounded former members should speak out. Big priority is recovery and to make available whatever caring support each one may need. However, Opus Dei generates a great deal of fear. The prelature should be obliged to acknowledge serious damage done to many people, so often as a result of irresponsible proselytism that failed to consider the good of the individual. Their tactics are systemic, described by Jose Maria Escriva in The Way and in many internal documents and in his various talks to members. Eileen's experiences are eerily similar to Valio's. Both individuals were true believers in Opus Dei's mission. Both rose to positions of authority within the organization's administration, and for both of them, the reality that they were forced to contend with ultimately became the factor which destroyed their faith in the institution and exposed the true nature of the organization that they had devoted so many years of their life to. And for Opus Dei's part, rather than addressing the real concerns that Eileen and Valio brought to their attention, they chose to attempt to suppress and control the situation using drugs. Following the 2021 AP story about 43 former Opus Dei domestic workers alleging human rights violations and labor trafficking in Argentina and elsewhere, BBC New Mundo published a story on August 2nd, 2022 with a headline, "They told us that God asked us to serve. The 43 former domestic employees in South America who denounced Opus Dei before the Vatican for servitude and exploitation." One of those 43 whistleblowers is Alicia Torancio, who spent 16 years of her life in Opus Dei after being recruited in 1994 at the age of 16. But the final 6 years were the most harrowing for her. She recounted the environment and expectations that she was exposed to while working as an assistant numerary. Here are some of her quotes directly from that article. "They tell you that you offer your work to God. I was concerned that I would no longer be able to send money to my parents. They said, you no longer have to worry about your parents. Now your family is Opus Dei." She said, "They cut off ties with your family and with the outside world, but you are also prohibited from making friends with any of your colleagues. They watch you all the time and immediately get your attention. They infantilized you all the time. You had to ask permission for the dumbest things and you had no money to handle yourself." At 22, Alicia was appointed head of the kitchen at Laya, the largest assistant numerary residence in the country, located in the prestigious neighborhood of Recoleta in Buenos Aires. This meant that she was responsible for the menu, shopping, and service for the the 100 Opus Dei men who lived there. The pressure was profound and the weight of the responsibility was crushing. The article notes that in Opus Dei there is a manual for everything, and any questioning of what is lived is addressed as a vocational doubt that has a standardized answer. Any vocational doubt was addressed by the institution as a psychological or psychiatric problem with a consequent supply of psychotropic drugs to neutralize the will, the complaint of the 43 women say in the complaint to the Vatican. Thus, it's not really surprising that Opus Dei chose to treat Alicia's stress and overload the same way it treated Eileen and Valio. The article goes on to say that psychiatrists and psychologists are always members of Opus Dei. Alicia was first taken to a psychiatrist who told her that she had nothing and was pretending to have depression. What they always tell you is that if Jesus and the great saints endured so much pain, how can you not bear it? Alicia was taken to another psychiatrist who decided to treat her. They gave me pills right away, but it was always something that took effect at first but then wore off. I had to take 7 to 8 pills a day or more. I was a zombie and weighed 45 kilos, which is about 99 pounds, because I couldn't eat. I fell into a well and started having suicidal ideations. Alicia spent 6 years like this. I couldn't get up. I was in such bad shape that they asked my family for permission to treat me with electroshock. Luckily, they said no. After an overdose of pills, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and only then did her administration give her permission to go home with her family. The part of this that didn't really jump out at me until I read through it just now is the part where Alicia says that Opus Dei asked her family for permission to treat her with electroshock therapy. Now, I'm not exactly sure when this experience occurred. I don't know if it says in the article exactly when each of these individual experiences occurred, what year it was when Alicia had this experience and Opus Dei wanted to use electroshock on her to fix her. But from what I understand, electroshock isn't something that's commonly used anymore. It's kind of something from the horror days of mental health care in this country, kind of like lobotomies. You don't really lobotomize someone for the same reason you don't electroshock their brain. And if it is done, from my understanding, it's only done on like very case-by-case basis for individual patients treating very specific, difficult situations. I might be wrong on that. If you know more about electroshock therapy, please feel free to sound off in the comments down below, because I would be interested in knowing more about that. But the fact that they asked her family for permission to treat her with electroshock makes me wonder how many other people in Opus Dei have been treated with electroshock and how recently that has been practiced. That is kind of scary to me. Honestly, it freaks me out, and it really puts into perspective how little control these people have over their lives once they are in Opus Dei and they are taking all of these substances. It's really, really heavy. Alicia ended up leaving Opus Dei at nearly 30 years of age with just a small suitcase and a little bag of personal items. In all her 13 years in Opus Dei, Alicia says she never made any money for even one of the hours worked. Quote, "They didn't tell us we were working. They told us we were sanctifying ourselves, that what God asked us to do was serve, and that we were thus helping to transform the world." Alicia still bears the scars from the spiked chain members were instructed to wear strapped around their upper thigh. This article is linked down below in my source document if you are interested in reading it in its entirety. It is a very, very good article, and it touches on a number of the concerning aspects of this organization, specifically in regard to labor law violations and human rights issues. Another former member shared their experience with Opus Dei's suppressive techniques on the Opus Dei Awareness Network, ODAN, in an article titled "Deception and Drugs in Opus Dei." It was written by someone who identifies himself as Maria, who is a former Numerary from Venezuela who was recruited by a Numerary she met while studying at university. Her experiences mirror the experiences other former members have recounted. Although Maria was initially happy with her new vocation, doubts began to set in rapidly upon moving into the center. She wrote, "At first, I was happy as a numerary, but I soon noticed troubling inconsistencies. I found the way we recruited new members manipulative and deceptive. A significant incident was when I invited my friend Carolina to a conference in Rome, believing she had a vocation to become a numerary. However, when she was admitted as a numerary, I was told to sever our personal friendship, which I found disturbing. Carolina was later denied numerary status due to her asthma and was admitted as a supernumerary instead. She was devastated by this news, and when I listened to her disappointment, I was reprimanded for disobeying the directors." She goes on to describe the way that her directors handled her struggles. Any doubts that she expressed in regard to her vocation were treated as temptations from the devil. She wrote, "I felt like I was living a lie, but was afraid to leave because I didn't want to be doomed to hell. They also told me that if I said no to my vocation, I would never be happy or be able to live in the grace of God again. There was a point in my life when I prayed to the founder more than I did to God, almost like if the founder was becoming more important to me than God himself." 5 years in, Maria's chatter informed her that she magically no longer had a vocation. When she asked to leave, though, she was told that she was expected to stay in the center for another month. And there's no explanation or reasoning given for that, but clearly, if you are informed that you no longer have the thing that was binding you to an organization that you are no longer happy in, you would probably want to get out of there pretty quickly. Maria refused to stay at the center for another month and requested to call her family to come and get her, but that request was denied. And when she attempted to leave the center, they hid the keys and locked the door. She states, "They even had me take Rohypnol, a very strong antidepressant that makes you very sleepy, saying that it would help me get some rest. I took it not knowing how strong that medicine really was and the fact that it made you so sedated that you couldn't even think straight." When she continued to be non-compliant, she was finally permitted to leave. However, she left under duress. Maria was informed that she had never done the work's apostolate, but rather her own, and that if she ever spoke out against Opus Dei, her reputation would be ruined. It took 11 years for Maria to gain the perspective and healing necessary to begin sharing her experiences. She closes out her letter with a statement that, "I was so blind when I was a numerary. Everything is so clear now. There is no doubt in my heart that Opus Dei acts like a sect within the Catholic Church." 4 months ago, a former member stated that they experienced the exact same things that Eileen reported having experienced, and much, much more recently than Eileen did, which is why, again, I call into question whether or not anything has really changed inside Opus Dei, whether or not it really is a brave new world in there, or if it's just the exact same bullshit on a different day. Another community member weighed in the comments, and they said, "There should be no stigma attached to being prescribed and using psychiatric medication for short or even long periods of time when it is indicated and prescribed by a physician adhering to relevant professional medical standards. But there are so many of these crazy stories coming out of Opus Dei where psychiatric medications are abused and professional medical standards are violated. What amazes me is that no one at the senior level is able to pull back and see the big picture. Like, wait a minute, if so many of our folks end up needing psychiatric drugs, maybe we're doing something wrong. Maybe the system is broken and not the people. I guess it doesn't really amaze me. They're fanatics and are unable to see what they're doing, and they're following in the footsteps of a saint." Under that same post, another community member weighed in and shared their anecdotal and alleged experience. And by the way, I keep stressing the anecdotal and alleged part of this, more so just for reasons of protecting myself. I do not want to get into a litigious situation with this organization or anyone connected to it. So everything is alleged, everything is anecdotal unless proven in a court of law. But that does not mean that I find these accounts or experiences dubious or hard to believe. Far to the contrary. And I want to stress that here. But anyway, they wrote, when I left Opus Dei after being a Numerary for about a decade and being medicated for the last 3 years, every outside doctor I saw was shocked by both the combination of drugs I was prescribed, but also the very high dosage. Once I left the center and stopped taking those medicines, my brain fog lifted. I didn't even know it was there. I'd had it for so long, and all my symptoms improved dramatically. In the years since, I've had doctors confirm the diagnosis I was given in the work, and I'm not cured, but I've never even come close to the level of mental health crises or physical symptoms I suffered while in the hands of the doctors of the work. I have also not needed nearly as much medical intervention or anything long-term. Most of my residual mental health struggles are traced back to trauma related to my time in Opus Dei. It's the same story we keep hearing over and over again. I left Opus Dei in the 2010s and only years later discovered how common my experience was. One of the Opus Dei doctors I saw for years was not a psychiatrist, but prescribed me the high doses of psychiatric meds. The other was a psychiatrist who traveled from Spain to our region periodically to see the hordes of numeraries with a plethora of mental illnesses. Incidentally, the very first doctor of the work that I ever went to was moderate and prudent. She did not prescribe me anything and wanted to do more tests, etc., but then she left the work. The subdirector of my center at the time made a comment that it's hard for these doctors to be faithful because they think they know better, end quote. And if that quote doesn't just perfectly encapsulate how pompous Opus Dei is in its attitude towards any and everyone, then I really don't know what will. They won't even cede to the educated opinion of a medical professional who is attempting to take care of one of their own people. I mean, it doesn't get much more prideful than that. On another post discussing various issues former members have with how Opus Dei is structured and run, several community members weighed in on the use and alleged abuse of psychotropic drugs within the institution, and one individual said, "They are of the opinion that mental illnesses can be managed by drugs. They don't see that many times therapy with a professional counselor is what is needed to talk through root issues, and also that sometimes it could be a diet with too much sugar causing some problems." Another said, "It's worse. They drug you if you think bad thoughts. They cause the mental imbalance. I remember I was called mentally unbalanced for merely questioning Opus by an Opus priest, and I repeated his assessment several ways to be sure that was the sole cause of my imbalance. I told another friend on the phone I had deep issues with Opus, and his immediate response was to ask whether I had thought about taking meds to help me. Drugs are their go-to only solution for the problems which they mostly cause, and in some cases it's not the mental problems but just questioning Opus or trying to leave. For any and every discrepancy under the sun, it's like Oprah Winfrey on a stage. You get some pills, and you get some pills, and you get some pills, and it doesn't matter if you need them or not. You're going to take them, and you're going to be happy, and you're not going to be a problem for them anymore, because that is all they care about." Last but not least, before we conclude, I wanted to include a couple of DMs and emails that I have received since I announced that I would be focusing on this particular issue. The first I'll read came from someone who I will refer to as Danny. Danny wrote, "In 2011, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety by a doctor of Opus Dei who was not a psychiatrist. A few months later, a psychiatrist doctor of Opus Dei confirmed the diagnosis and prescribed several medications to me. I took those in obedience from 2011 until early 2014, despite having left in 2013. I have been provided enough medication to continue taking them for months after I left. When I was first diagnosed, the director kept all my drugs and gave them to me as needed, but after some months, I had all my drugs with me and I took them as prescribed. After I left, it took several months before I ran out of drugs, and at that point, I went to see a new psychiatrist and neurologist who were not affiliated with Opus Dei. In that first visit, I discovered that the antidepressants I was taking also had a strong sedative effect, and the new psychiatrist did not think they were ideal for me for that reason. That even if the particular type of antidepressants were justified, and the psychiatrist did not think that they were, I was taking a very high dose of the antidepressants, about 3 times the dosage that the new psychiatrist would have considered normal for my symptoms and clinical history, and also for the period of time that I had been taking them. I had several vitamin deficiencies that should have been checked and addressed before prescribing the psychiatric medicines, and in addition to the antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, I had been prescribed antipsychotic drugs by the Opus Dei doctor. This was also something the new psychiatrist found found puzzling. I was discontinued from all previous medication and given low doses of new medication. Most of my symptoms resolved in less than 1 year after I left the work. In the time since I left, while I have had instances of struggling with my mental health, I have not experienced anything close to the seriousness of the mental health issues I had while I was in Numerary. Danny, if you are watching this now, I want you to know that I find what you went through absolutely horrifying, and I want you to know that you have my deepest sympathy. One of the details from her story that stands out to me is the fact that she didn't immediately, automatically have access to her own medication when it was prescribed. They were kept from her and controlled, and she was treated like a child. She wrote in her account about how her director initially kept all of her medication, and I'm speculating here, but I am almost certain that that director was not Danny's legal guardian. Danny was an adult, and again, I am speculating, but I am also equally as certain that the director was not trained in any type of medical care beyond maybe basic first aid and should not have been responsible for doling out these types of substances. The director should not have been standing between Danny and her medication. That's just, it's completely bass-ackwards. Again, this is pure speculation. I, of course, can have no idea because I'm not on the inside, but based on what I have been told by former members, my point is that these directors are not uniquely suited or divinely ordained to be everyone else's big brother, although Opus Dei definitely wants its members to think that they are, but they should not be responsible for the decisions that an individual makes concerning their health and the medications that they do or do not take. They should not be responsible for that. Honestly, the mental picture, what I'm imagining the inside of these centers is like, it's like something out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That is what I am imagining, and that it's incredibly disordered and wrong and unethical on so many different levels. The second message came from someone I'll call T. And T wrote that while at her training center, she was deeply depressed and very homesick, despite the fact that she had left a very troubled home life behind. She often complained to her chatter about different physical difficulties that she was experiencing, like amenorrhea, which is when a woman's period disappears, headaches, painful breasts, and generalized pain in the body. She also mentioned that she was sure she had depression and anxiety, but it took at least 5, if not 6 years before she was finally allowed to see a doctor. And that doctor assured her that she did not have depression after all, but rather PMS. And of course, one of the symptoms of PMS is depression, so T's not really sure why this doctor was so reluctant to diagnose her with depression, except that maybe she didn't like the label. Anyway, she proceeded to prescribe T 150 milligrams of amitriptyline to be taken a day. She never saw a doctor outside of Opus Dei. She was never offered a follow-up consultation with another doctor, and the script was issued dosed to her for the following years that she remained in Opus Dei. She says she thinks it was about 5 or 6, but she can't be sure. She said she was also prescribed saline tablets to see if that would relieve the soreness in her breasts, but it did not. However, it did work to reduce her weight. And T mentioned in another email to me that while she was in Opus Dei, she also struggled with anorexia, which is another symptom, another illness that I have heard of people, specifically women in Opus Dei, suffering from very often. Nobody ever checked on or cared about T. And she says she thinks she understood that she was not going to be taken seriously or given the attention that she needed. The amitriptyline kept her in a zombified and subdued state for the most part. She would have to drink very strong shots of coffee just to get through mass and prayers, and ended up with shakes and tingles and involuntary jerks in her arms from the caffeine. Thankfully, those concerning symptoms did not stick around, and after she left Opus Dei, she stopped taking amitriptyline. Her GP was horrified that she had been on such a high dose and for so long without a review. In my opinion, Opus Dei weaponizes mental health. It takes protocols and medications that are supposed to help people and weaponizes them to benefit whatever goal or issue is at hand. Everyone should have access to mental health care resources, but this ain't it. And for what it's worth, no one ever forgets a bad experience, a bad reaction to a medication. Full disclosure here, because I don't think that this should be stigmatized or controversial or seen as problematic in any way, but over the years, I have taken different antidepressants as well, and I've had a couple that I had to stop taking because they simply did not agree with me. They just didn't work with my brain and my body and my own unique chemical makeup. It actually just made everything worse. It would take hours for me to get out of bed in the morning to get my life together. I felt like a zombie. I felt like my head was wrapped in cotton. I couldn't think straight. And this was after only maybe a month or two. I stopped taking the medication after that because I was not willing to put up with the symptoms anymore. Imagine what that would do to a person if you had to live like that for several years, which nearly every experience that we've gone over in this episode, what played out over the course of years of a person's life. I don't think that we can stress how disastrous this type of medical malpractice is. It's tampering with someone's brain chemistry, which is an incredibly delicate balance of hormones that you do not want to needlessly mess with. And I have said it before, and I will say it again. This is how you kill someone, or at the very least, so irrevocably fuck up their brain chemistry that they will never be able to have stable mental health ever again. So it is tremendously difficult for me to come away from reading stories like these and see Opus Dei as anything other than predatory and opportunistic. And I want to be so clear. I have a bias here. My bias is that Opus Dei should cease to exist because, in my opinion, from my position as a third-party outsider never having been involved with Opus Dei, I find these stories compelling and more than a little alarming. I wasn't there, and I have no irrefutable proof that these events took place, that these people have been or are being drugged and deprived of liberty, but when I take in the full picture with everything that I know in full context, my gut tells me that this is all probably true too. In my opinion, from my point of view, pure speculation, We're going to call this episode part 1 of a little mini-series that I am doing on Opus Dei's drug problem. Consider this just the tip of the Opus Dei drug abuse iceberg. I am not doing this to stretch this out to get the most bang for my buck content-wise or anything either. Please know, if I could squeeze all of this into a single episode, I absolutely would. But I'll be honest, I found a lot when I went digging. I found more than I expected to find. I started this research back in September, and here we are, and it's almost the end of the year. But this is so important, and it's a story or a series of stories that I believe deserves to be told. Similar to the Tissier case, it feels like an active effort has been made to keep this situation from escaping Opus Dei's control, and I have to think that it is probably for similar reasons. Opus Dei is allergic to the light of day. So with that said, the next episode will be a deep dive into at least one of the individuals who have been accused of medical malpractice on behalf of Opus Dei. And this is someone who I discovered completely by accident, but he is a piece of work and he deserves the exposure. So let me know if you think you know who I'm referring to. With that said, that is where I'm going to conclude things today. This is a very heavy topic, so I want to remind everyone that if you are in need of mental health support, I have left some resources and links in the description of this episode. Life is hard, but we do not have to go into it totally unequipped, and therapy and counseling can be tremendously helpful tools. So if you need help, please reach out. I also want to acknowledge the slow glacial pace that these videos have been coming out in. Everyone has been very understanding, which I appreciate, but I want you all to know that I do realize that these episodes are a long time in coming out, and I wish that I could pump them out faster. But the honest truth is that, at least for this juncture in my life, that is simply not possible. I care too much about the quality of the work that I am doing and the research that I present to rush things, and I am just one woman cramming this into a life that is already very full and very busy. So thank you for continuing to show up and watch these episodes regardless of when they can come out. I can't make any promises or guarantees about an upload schedule, but I can promise you that I am always chipping away at the next piece of research, and whenever it is done, I will share it with you here. Thank you for making it to this point in this video and for all of the support. Seeing this channel grow and attract such wonderful, interesting people has been a wild experience. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and giving this video a big thumbs up. Despite the pace of the uploads, I do have some exciting things on the horizon, and I am hoping that you will want to stick around and see what those are, because I think you're going to be interested in them. Links to connect with me on social media are down below. These videos take a lot of time and energy, and I drink a lot of coffee while I write them, so if you are interested in supporting my work monetarily, you can buy me a coffee for $5, and the link for that is down in the description of this video. You do not have to. It is purely optional. Just interacting with my videos, watching them all the way through, giving them a thumbs up, leaving a comment, just that does so much to boost my channel and the work that I am doing. But I sincerely appreciate everyone who has bought me a coffee up to this point. Those of you who bought me a coffee in the last month are here on the screen, and I would like you to know that I would be happy to get a cup of joe with you anytime. Thank you for being here, and remember, nolite te bastardes carborum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.